What if I told you there's a business you can start on your kitchen counter for under $50 that some people are turning into thousands of dollars a month? No storefront, no employees, no inventory sitting on a shelf collecting dust for 6 months waiting to sell. Just a bucket, some straw, and a fungus that grows faster than almost anything else on Earth. Today we're breaking down exactly how mushroom farming works as a side hustle, the real startup costs, which mushrooms actually make money, how people are selling out at farmers markets, and the mistakes that will wipe out your entire first batch if you're not careful. So let's get into it. Let's start with the obvious question. Out of every possible side hustle you could choose, why mushrooms? Here's the thing that makes this different from almost every other small agriculture business. Most agriculture ventures need land, need seasons, need patience measured in months or even years before you see a dollar. Mushrooms flip that entire equation on its head. Under the right conditions, you can go from a tiny sample of spawn, which is basically the mushroom equivalent of seeds, to a full harvest in as little as 7 to 10 days. And that same small sample can be expanded into hundreds of pounds of product once you understand how to scale your substrate. That's the raw material the mushrooms actually eat, by the way. More on that in a minute. Here's the other thing that makes mushrooms unique. They don't photosynthesize. They're not plants. They don't need sunlight the way a tomato or a pepper does. What they need is oxygen, moisture, and something to eat. That means you can grow a legitimate crop indoors, in a basement, in a closet, in a spare bedroom, with basically zero natural light required. Combine a fast turnaround time with almost no space requirement, and you get a business that is genuinely accessible to somebody starting completely from zero. No farm, no greenhouse, no acreage. Now let's talk about which mushroom you should actually grow if you're just getting into this. Not all mushrooms are created equal when you're a beginner. You want two things working in your favor right out of the gate. Something that's forgiving to grow, and something that sells for a real premium once it's ready. That combination points almost every single beginner toward the same answer: oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms are aggressive growers, which means they tend to outcompete mold and other contamination better than more delicate species do. They're forgiving of an imperfect setup, which matters a lot when you're working out of your kitchen with secondhand equipment instead of a professional lab. And on top of all that, they still command a solid retail price, often somewhere in the range of $15 to $20 a pound depending on your local market. Some growers push closer to 20 or even higher for premium retail sales directly to customers. There are other popular options too. Lion's mane has a dense, meaty texture that a lot of people compare to crab meat or even steak, and it often sells at a similar or even higher price point. Shiitake is another classic, but both of those take longer to produce, sometimes a full month or two per flush, and they're less forgiving if your process isn't dialed in yet. So the general advice from people who've actually built these businesses is simple. Start with oysters, get your contamination control and your process nailed down, then branch out into other species once you understand what you're doing. Now let's talk about real numbers, because this is where most people either get scared off completely or they make the opposite mistake and overspend before they even know what they're doing. Think of this as 3 tiers of investment. Tier 1 is under $50. A basic grow kit runs somewhere between $15 and $25, whether you order it online or pick one up from a store that carries mushroom supplies. That kit gets you spawn that's already colonizing a small block of substrate, ready to fruit. Add a secondhand pot for pasteurizing straw and a simple 5-gallon bucket, and you are growing your very first batch of mushrooms for well under $50 total. This is genuinely one of the lowest barriers to entry of any small business you'll find. Tier 2 is a few $100s. Once you've successfully harvested your first batch and you know the process actually works for you, the next step up usually involves buying bulk substrate, whether that's straw or hardwood pellets, plus a proper grow tent or a humidity tent so you can actually control temperature and moisture instead of guessing. This is the range where people start thinking beyond a single one-off harvest and start planning for consistent weekly batches instead. Tier 3 is several $1,000s, and this is where people build out an actual dedicated grow room. That might mean converting part of a shed or a basement, adding an air conditioning unit for temperature control, building out shelving, and installing a HEPA filter fan to keep the air clean while you're working with your blocks. At this level, you're not just growing mushrooms for yourself or a couple of friends anymore. You're setting up to supply restaurants consistently or to run multiple farmers market stands at once. Here's the important part though. The biggest mistake beginners make is not spending too little. It's spending too much before they've actually proven they can grow a clean, contamination contamination-free batch. Start small, prove the process works, then scale once you know what you're doing. So let's actually walk through how this works, step by step in the simplest version possible. Step 1 is pasteurizing your substrate. You boil straw for about 20 to 30 minutes. This step matters more than almost anything else in the entire process because it kills off competing mold and bacteria that would otherwise outcompete your mushrooms for the same food source. Skip this step and you're basically inviting mold to win the race before your mushrooms even get started. Step 2 is cooling and draining. After boiling, you let the straw sit and drain off the excess water, so what you're left with is damp, not soaking wet. Too much moisture creates the wrong environment and actually encourages contamination instead of preventing it. Step 3 is layering and inoculating. This is where you alternate layers of straw with your mushroom spawn inside a bucket that has a few small holes drilled around the sides for airflow. The idea here is that your spawn needs to essentially overwhelm any remaining mold or bacteria in the straw. Think of it as a race, and you want your mushroom spawn to win by a landslide. Step 4 is incubation. Over the next several days, you'll start to see white web-like growth spreading through the straw. That's mycelium, and it's a great sign. The mold you actually need to worry about tends to show up as green, black, or fuzzy colored patches, very different from the clean white webbing of healthy mycelium. If you see colors other than white starting to take over, that batch is likely contaminated and won't produce a healthy harvest. Step 5 is fruiting and harvesting. Once your block is fully colonized with that white mycelium, small pins will start to form within a couple of days. And within another day or two after that, you'll have full mushrooms ready to twist and pull right off the block. For oyster mushrooms specifically, you know they're ready when the cap starts to tilt upward. Grab it at the base, give it a gentle twist, and pull. That's genuinely the entire harvesting technique. Contamination is, without question, the single biggest risk in this whole process. Skipping the boiling step, using dirty tools, or working in a dusty, unfiltered room can wipe out an entire batch of mushrooms in a matter of days. And that's a lesson almost every mushroom farmer learns the expensive way at least once. Losing a batch to mold isn't just a financial hit either. If you've already got customers expecting a delivery, it can cost you trust and reputation too, which in a relationship-driven business like this one can matter even more than the immediate dollar loss. Now let's talk about the part that actually turns this from a hobby into a business. Selling what you grow. Growing mushrooms is genuinely only half the equation. The other half is moving product, and there are really two main paths available to you. Path 1 is retail, selling directly to consumers. Think farmers markets, local pop-up events, or even a small stand somewhere with decent foot traffic. This is where you get top dollar per pound because there's no middleman taking a cut. The trade-off is time. You have to physically be there, standing at a table for hours at a stretch, or you have to pay someone else to be there on your behalf. Farmers markets can also come with entry fees, sometimes running into the hundreds or even over $1,000 for a full season at a high traffic location, but that cost can pay for itself within just a couple of strong sales days if the market is busy enough. Path 2 is wholesale, selling directly to restaurants and chefs. Here you're selling in larger bulk quantities at a lower price per pound, but the actual transaction moves fast. You drop off the order, you get paid, and you move on with the rest of your day. Chefs tend to love working with local mushroom growers because the product is fresher than anything a large distributor can typically offer, and that freshness genuinely matters both for flavor and for how long the mushrooms hold up in the kitchen. Here's the thread that runs through almost every successful mushroom side hustle story out there. Relationships. Farmers markets aren't just about the individual sale happening in front of you at any given moment. They're where you actually meet the chefs, the regulars, and the local customers who eventually become your repeat wholesale and retail clients over time. Showing up consistently, being genuinely easy to work with, and bringing a product that's actually fresh tends to matter more in this business than any polished sales pitch ever could. So which path should you choose? Retail generally means higher margin per pound, but it costs you more time. Wholesale generally means lower margin per pound, but it lets you scale faster because the transactions themselves are quick. A lot of successful growers end up running both at once. Farmers markets for the higher margin retail sales and the relationship building, and a handful of steady restaurant clients for consistent, predictable wholesale income in between market days. Let's talk about a realistic timeline, because I don't want to oversell this to you. Month 1 is really about proving to yourself that you can grow a clean batch without contamination wiping it out. That's the foundational skill everything else is built on. Month 2 or month 3 is usually when people start selling consistently for the first time. Maybe a local farmer's market table, maybe a first small restaurant client willing to take a chance on you. From there, growth tends to follow a seasonal pattern in a lot of climates. Demand often peaks in the warmer months when farmers markets are running at full capacity and foot traffic is high, and it tends to slow down heading into fall and winter unless you've built up enough restaurant relationships to keep selling consistently year-round regardless of season. It's important to be honest here. This usually isn't a business that replaces a full-time income overnight, but as a side hustle with genuinely low startup costs, fast production cycles measured in days instead of months, and strong profit margins once you've actually got your process figured out, it's one of the more accessible small-scale businesses you'll find anywhere. Let's also talk quickly about some of the most common mistakes people make so you can avoid them from day one. Mistake number 1 is overspending before you've proven the process works. It's tempting to buy the biggest, most impressive setup right out of the gate. Resist that urge. Start with the basic kit, get a couple of successful harvests under your belt, and only then start investing in bigger equipment. Mistake number 2 is skipping proper sterilization or pasteurization steps to save time. This almost always backfires. A contaminated batch costs you far more time and money than the extra 30 minutes it takes to properly boil your substrate in the first place. Mistake number 3 is underestimating how much of this business is actually about relationships rather than the product itself. You can grow beautiful mushrooms, but if you're not showing up consistently, communicating clearly, and building genuine trust with your customers and clients, you'll struggle to grow beyond a hobby. Mistake number 4 is trying to scale too many species at once before mastering even one. Master oyster mushrooms first. Understand contamination control, harvest timing, and your local market demand. Then, and only then, consider branching out into something like lion's mane or shiitake. If you're the type of person who likes the idea of a business, you can literally start on your own kitchen table. With an investment measured in tens of dollars instead of thousands, mushroom farming is genuinely worth a serious look. It rewards patience, cleanliness, and consistency far more than it rewards a huge upfront investment. And for a side hustle, that's a pretty rare combination to find. Let's dig a little deeper into the actual economics, because numbers tend to make all of this feel a lot more real than just talking about it in the abstract. Say you're selling oyster mushrooms retail at around $18 a pound. A single well-managed grow block, something that might cost you only $1 or $2 in raw materials once you're buying substrate in bulk, can realistically produce multiple pounds across its first and second flush, which is the industry term for each wave of mushrooms a block produces before it's spent. That means your raw material cost per pound sold can end up being a small fraction of your final sale price, especially once you're not paying retail prices for supplies anymore. That's where the margins in this business start to look genuinely attractive, sometimes reported in the range of 80 to 90% net profit once your equipment costs are already paid off and you're just running consistent production. Of course, margins on paper and money in your pocket are two different things. You have to account for your time, your farmer's market fees if you go that route, packaging, transportation, and the inevitable slow weeks. But even accounting for all of that, mushroom farming tends to have noticeably better margins than a lot of other small agriculture side hustles, mostly because the production cycle is so short and the raw materials are so cheap relative to the final retail price. Let's also talk about scaling, because a lot of people watching this are probably wondering what happens after month 6 or month 12 once you've proven the model works on a small scale. The first scaling decision most growers face is whether to keep doing everything themselves, from pasteurizing substrate to inoculating blocks to selling at markets, or whether to start outsourcing certain steps. A lot of established growers eventually choose to buy pre-made, already inoculated grow blocks from a specialized supplier instead of making every single block from scratch themselves. It costs a little more per block, but it dramatically reduces contamination risk and frees up hours in your week that would otherwise go toward the most technical, most failure-prone part of the entire process. That trade-off, paying a bit more for reliability and time, is one almost every grower eventually has to weigh for themselves. The second scaling decision is where you actually grow. Space and overhead tend to be the biggest bottleneck once you move past a hobby scale operation. Some growers convert part of a garage or a shed. Others find creative low-cost arrangements, like partnering with someone who has unused barn or outbuilding space in exchange for helping out around the property. Getting access to free or low-cost space can save thousands of dollars a year compared to renting a dedicated commercial space, and that saved overhead goes straight back into either growing the business faster or simply keeping more of what you earn. The third scaling decision is diversifying your sales channels. Relying entirely on one or two farmers markets means your income is tied directly to however many people happen to walk by your table on a given Saturday. Layering in wholesale relationships with a handful of restaurants creates a more predictable income floor underneath the higher variance of retail sales. And some growers eventually add a third channel entirely, selling grow kits directly to hobbyists online, which taps into people who want the experience of growing their own mushrooms at home rather than just buying the finished product. One last thing worth mentioning before we wrap up. A lot of the knowledge needed to actually start this business is available for free right now through videos, forums, and grower communities online. You genuinely do not need a formal background in mycology or agriculture to get started. What separates the people who turn this into a real side income from the people who buy a kit and never touch it again usually comes down to two things: consistency in following the sterilization and growing process correctly every single time, and consistency in actually showing up to sell what you grow week after week, even when the first few attempts at building relationships with customers feel a little awkward or slow. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure you're subscribed for more real startup numbers and founder breakdowns like this one. And let me know, would you actually try growing and selling mushrooms yourself? What's stopping you? Drop it in the comments below.